During World War II, one of the most challenging logistical tasks for the German army was the supply and transportation of fuel to its mechanized units, particularly its iconic Panzer divisions. With extensive operations across Europe and the harsh expenses of the Soviet Union, the fuel logistics system was essential to German war strategy, yet suffered from significant limitations and vulnerabilities. The blitzkrieg tactics that became synonymous with German strategy involved rapid, armored advances supported by mechanized infantry and air support. This approach, while devastating in its initial successes, depended on reliable and continuous fuel supplies for tanks and other vehicles. A single Panzer division, including tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and other vehicles, required hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel per day, with a Panzer III or a Panzer IV medium tank consuming between 2 liters of fuel per kilometer on average. The German Army's fuel transportation system relied on two key components: railways and road convoys. Each method had its own strengths and weaknesses, but as German forces moved further into Soviet territory, maintaining fuel supply lines became progressively difficult. Railroads were the backbone of the German logistical network. Fuel was transported from Germany or from occupied territories to the front lines by rail as long as the rail lines were operational. German logistics officers organized specialized fuel trains equipped with tanker cars to move large quantities of fuel. These trains could move fuel relatively efficiently, but were limited by the extent and condition of the rail network. Where railroads could not reach, the German army relied on motorized fuel convoys to carry fuel closer to the front line. These convoys consisted of trucks that were organized to shuttle fuel from depots or railheads to forward supply points. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, most of the German fuel transport vehicles were marked with a large painted BUG sign, which stood for Betriebsstoff und Gerät, or fuel and equipment. These letters could be on the doors, side of the cargo bed, or on the back of the vehicle. But after the outbreak of the war, most letters were made considerably smaller or completely removed. These trucks were used to haul the 200 liters fuel drums. These drums could be used directly, or the fuel could be poured into more manageable 20 liters Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, or the Army's standard canister. This canister was developed in 1937 for the German Army and was found in almost all European and North African theaters of war during the Second World War. It is important to note that the containers are still produced today in large numbers in many NATO countries. In English-speaking countries, the canisters are also called jerry cans, from jerry as a colloquial term for Germans. However, transporting fuel by truck was fuel-intensive itself, as the trucks consumed a considerable portion of fuel they carried. Convoys were also vulnerable to air attacks, enemy ambushes, and poor condition on roads, especially during the muddy Rasputitsa season in the Soviet Union. To maintain fuel flow toward the front lines, the German army established fuel depots along the routes from Germany to the various fronts. These depots acted as storage points and allowed for the organization of fuel distribution. As the front lines moved, the Germans tried to establish forward supply points closer to the advancing units. By maintaining these depots was challenging, especially during the extended Soviet campaigns, where distances were vast and resources were scarce. To extend the reach of fuel supplies, some German units employed field refueling trucks. These trucks were equipped with pumps and hoses, and they could refuel tanks and other vehicles directly at forward positions, but they were only effective when close to supply lines and had their own logistical vulnerabilities, including susceptibility to enemy air attacks. The German fuel transportation system faced a range of difficulties that finally hampered the German army's operational reach and effectiveness during the war. In the Soviet Union, German rail lines were frequent targets for Soviet partisans who sabotaged tracks, bridges, and trains to disrupt supply routes. These attacks forced the Germans to allocate troops to guard rail lines and repair infrastructure, which further strained their resources and slowed fuel deliveries. As the German advance into the Soviet territory continued, the sheer distance between the supply points and the front became a critical issue. The roads were often unpaved, narrow, and turned impassable mud in the fall and spring, limiting the mobility of fuel convoys and delaying fuel supplies. The prioritization of fuel became increasingly complex as the war progressed. High-demand units such as the Panzer divisions were often prioritized, leading to shortages among other essential units. The German High Command had to balance fuel needs among the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and this lack of an effective prioritization mechanism sometimes resulted in fuel reaching frontline units too late or in insufficient quantities. Fuel shortages and logistical failures in fuel supply were major factors in some of the German army's significant setbacks. During Operation Barbarossa and subsequent Soviet campaigns, the German Panzers often had to halt due to lack of fuel, losing the momentum essential to blitzkrieg tactics. The issue became critical during the Ardennes Offensive in late 1944, when the German army launched a counteroffensive aiming to capture Allied fuel depots to sustain their advance. However, the lack of fuel stocks ultimately contributed to the operation's failure as German units stalled due to fuel shortages. The German army's fuel transportation system during World War II was a complex, resource-intensive operation hampered by significant logistical challenges and vulnerabilities. Dependent on rail networks, vulnerable to partisan attacks, and limited by Germany's own fuel production capacity, the German army struggled to keep its mechanized units adequately supplied. Finally, the inability to maintain fuel supplies at the necessary scale and speed contributed to the stalling of German offensive, hindering their ability to sustain the rapid advances that they had initially brought them so much success. In the broader scope of the war, fuel logistics often an overlooked aspect of military strategy, proved to be a decisive factor in the outcome of German operations and, by extension, the outcome of the war itself. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to support my channel, check out the PayPal donation link in the description or consider becoming a member. To make sure you don't miss my future work, subscribe to my channel please and press the bell notification button. Thank you and see you in the next video.